setting Washington's agenda. The Morning Majority, 5 to 9 on 630 WMAL.
8:36 on WMAL. Brian Neiman, Tony Blankley in this morning, joined now by Larry Kudlow, host of the Kudlow Report. Check him out 7 o'clock CNBC. Also on the call 11 this morning on CNBC, and the Larry Kudlow Radio Show, heard here on WMAL 7 o'clock on Saturday nights. Good morning, Larry.
Morning. Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, Tom.
I had, I've always been a big fan of Tom Coburn's, and when he dropped out of the Gang of Six, I was depressed because I always thought if there was one guy that could actually broker a deal and sell it, especially to conservatives, it would be Tom Coburn. I know you talked to him last week. Why did he drop out, and do you see him ever getting back into that Gang of Six?
I think the Gang of Six is dead. He dropped out because they didn't want to cut entitlements enough, mostly Medicare, from what he told me. And I also think there was a tax hike piece, although he didn't really talk about that. I don't know. I never look. There's one set of talks now. That was the Biden talks over the debt ceiling and what will be attached to the debt ceiling in the way of spending cuts and structural spending reforms and caps. That's the only game in town. That's as much as Washington can possibly focus on at one time, and we'll see what it comes up with. But that one's going to go right down to the wire.
So it's all focused on the debt ceiling. That's what we're at right now. It
has to be. That's the driver. That's the compelling event. I have a lot of sympathy with people like Senator Mark Warner. I've interviewed him. I think he's a really bright guy, but I never understood how that particular group could possibly come to dominate the whole budget process. The Democrats themselves who run the Senate, right, they don't have a budget. So I never really got that. But again, let me just say, the debt ceiling is going to be the operating, moving, forcing, compelling event, and we're still pretty far apart from what everybody tells me.
Let me ask you, Lance, this will be decided around the first week of August, presumably, before the break, and that's about when Geithner says he can hang out until. Assuming that we do not get a big good cut, but everybody kind of just does some minor cut, and they get the debt ceiling passed, but not satisfactory for those of us who are concerned about the deficit. How do you think the markets react to that? That's sort of like the last shot that Washington gets at dealing with the deficit, I would guess, in a serious way before the 2012 election year.
Tony, I think there's going to be a last shot, but it's a moving target. In other words, August 2nd is just kind of one of those arbitrary targets. And remember this, the revenues are coming in. So you're going to have to prioritize or designate those revenues. But if there's no deal, then you can finance the debt. There's no
I understand that. I just meant assuming that whenever the final political effort is made in Washington and it doesn't succeed at dealing with the deficit seriously, but it does, let's assume, pass a debt ceiling raise. How do you think the markets will be crushingly disappointed, or just shrug their shoulders and go on?
Shrug.
Okay.
We've been here before. I think that fundamentally, right now bond rates are falling and bond prices are rising because they're worried about a slow economy. But the fundamental point there is inflation and economic growth expectations tend to drive interest rates. That's a little simple, but actually not far from the truth. So I'm doubtful that the debt ceiling is going to really influence bonds. I think if you tell me the United States is going to default on a $100 billion bond issue, I think we have a problem. I think we have a major problem. But failing some kind of Greece-like thing, I don't see it, and I don't take it lightly. I want to be clear on that.
Yeah.
But again, I don't see it. I think that the interesting thing to me right now is how the Republicans are going to handle this, and what the Republican message is. I'm not hearing the candidates talk about debt ceiling. Maybe they don't figure they have to. I think John Boehner's operating idea that there's got to be $1 of spending cut at least for every dollar increase in the debt ceiling is the operating stratagem or the operating rule right now for policy purposes for the Republicans. I happen to agree with them. But let me also say, as an intermediate position, you could have a 3-month debt ceiling increase,
sure,
a 6-month. You know how that works. So those are all intermediate possibilities.
So if we're going to raise the debt ceiling by $2 trillion, Boehner in exchange wants $2 trillion worth of cuts?
Plus spending caps, plus structural spending caps or clear spending limitations.
And I get here. How do you codify that if you're Congress? I mean, you have to obviously pass a law to make sure.
Oh yeah, listen.
In order to do it,
Tony went through that in the '90s. I mean, you can create them, you can legislate them. You know, sometimes they last for a couple years, and you can do some good, and then sometimes they don't last. But I think that's, to me, my expectations are very low. I don't believe there's going to be a big bang deal. I think there'll be a small bang deal, and I think it's going to coalesce in late July, early August, and then everyone's going to take a look at the Treasury cash position, because that's going to be the key, and they're going to look at the trust funds, and they'll find ways to deal.
Well,
with
if your assessment, I understand you're just looking forward several months, it becomes a conventional wisdom in the sound, that puts less pressure on Congress to actually do something about the deficit.
Well, I guess so. That's the way that.
You can't get around your best judgment, but just politically, the thing that might drive a decision is cold fear that the bond market might react.
Yeah, don't wait for that. That's not going to happen.
That's good advice, Larry.
Because our market is so large. It's the U.S. Treasury market's the largest market in the world. It is the funding market around the world. So it just is different than, let's say a Greece or a Portugal.
Mm-hmm. It definitely doesn't feel as dire today as it did, say, a couple of months ago when it comes to the debt ceiling. I mean, I get that feeling being in this town and talking to people. I mean, it's just like, oh, okay, well, maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't happen.
I still see this as a political/fiscal event, not as a market/fiscal event. Now, that may change. We could be having this conversation in late July, and treasuries may be trading up from near 3% to 4%. That's possible, but I don't see any evidence of that right now.
Okay, final question, get your way. Tim Pawlenty yesterday announced that he's definitely going to run and said, you know what, we need to get rid of, ethanol as far as when it comes to subsidies in ethanol. And he said, I'm going to tell the people in Iowa that. Well, what'd you make of that?
I think that's very brave and courageous. I liked it very much. It shows that Governor Pawlenty has a lot of character, and he has good horse sense when it comes to policy. I'm an opponent of these ethanol subsidies, as I oppose all subsidies in the federal budget, all subsidies. Ethanol, by the way, has done a lot of bad things, including driving up wheat and corn prices, felt all around the world, including the Egyptian riots, by the by, Tunisian riots, so I think he's exactly right. But I will say that Tim Pawlenty's message right now is incomplete. He does not have, nor does any of them have, a real pro-growth economic message with clear pro-growth tax reform, clear pro-growth spending reforms, deregulation reforms, and stable dollar reforms. They don't have it yet. The Republican Party has got to have a growth message to fight 9% unemployment, to get back the 7 million jobs that are still lost, and then some, to move the economy to a 5% growth path, which is where it ought to be, coming out of this deep recession. We have a really, really, really poor economic recovery rate. The GOP has got to return to being the party of growth. Right now, I'm concerned that their message is too stringent, that there's 9% unemployment, and they're all hung up on taking away Medicare benefits. Even though I'm sympathetic to Medicare reform, they don't have a growth message. And until they get one, they're not going to attract a lot of excitement from either the grassroots or the rest of the country. Because growth is everything. Growth,
I assume
growth.
You think that a pro-growth message policy is not quite consistent with a rigorous immediate deficit reduction policy, right?
Well, look, I think the key to solving the budget deficit is faster economic growth. Yeah. I've always believed that. I still believe that. I think the deficit would be down to manageable terms if the economy were going at 5%. This was the lesson from the Reagan years. This was the lesson from the Kennedy years way before it. It's the lesson now. The baselines are too unmanageable at 2.5% to 3% growth, which, by the way, may be the upper end of what we're really growing at right now. We may be growing closer to 2% right now. And every 1 percentage point increase in real GDP over 10 years cuts the budget deficit by $3 trillion, $2.9 trillion by lowering spending demand and increasing revenues. And this is a message the GOP has not embraced on the campaign trail. Our friend Eric Cantor is putting together another growth model plan. He's just been releasing it. I think the rollout is on Thursday. That's the right idea, but I don't see it yet on the presidential candidates, with the possible exception of Herman Cain, who I think does have a growth message. But of the so-called, I don't know, frontier, if that's fair enough, Mr. Romney and Mr. Pawlenty. I don't see it yet. I think Pawlenty is going to come up with something, but I think he's very slow in putting it together.
All right, Larry. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate
Thank you.
Larry Kudlow, host of the Kudlow Report, 7 o'clock CNBC. Also, the Larry Kudlow radio show on WMAL Saturdays at 7.